The snow came without warning, the way death always did in the Wyoming territory of 1878, and Rose Barrett realized she was going to die before she ever reached Denver. The stagecoach had broken an axle somewhere along the eastern face of the Wind River Range, and the driver, a weathered old man named Cooter, had already unhitched the horses and ridden one of them toward the nearest outpost, promising he would return with help before nightfall. That had been 4 hours ago. Nightfall had come and gone. The temperature had dropped so fast and so hard that Rose could feel it in her teeth, in the very marrow of her bones, in the way her fingers refused to properly close around the edges of her wool traveling coat. She was 22 years old, traveling alone from Cheyenne to visit her ailing aunt in Denver, and she had made precisely the kind of mistake her mother had always warned her about, which was trusting that the world would cooperate with her plans. It had not cooperated. The stagecoach sat tilted and broken at the side of the mountain road like a wounded animal, and Rose sat inside it with her knees pulled to her chest, and her breath coming out in white clouds that dissolved immediately into the darkness. There were 2 other passengers who had been on the coach with her when the axle snapped. A traveling salesman named Mr. Holt had taken the second horse at a gallop the moment Cooter's back was turned, claiming he had a business meeting that could not wait. The third passenger, an elderly woman named Mrs. Price, had looked at Rose with something between apology and desperation, before announcing that she had a better chance of surviving the night walking to the farm she'd seen a mile back than sitting in a stalled coach. Rose had tried to go with her, but Mrs. Price had moved faster than any elderly woman had a right to move, and the snow had swallowed her within minutes. So Rose sat alone. She had 2 candles left in her traveling bag, and she'd already burned one down to nothing. The second was guttering in the draft that pushed through the cracked window the axle collapse had produced. She pressed her back into the corner of the seat and tried to remember everything she knew about surviving cold. She was not a frontier woman by nature. She had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a banker, educated and capable and entirely unprepared for the particular brutality of a Wyoming mountain blizzard in late October. The wind howled through the pines outside with a sound like someone screaming from very far away. She heard the horse before she saw the lantern light. A heavy, deliberate thudding of hooves in the snow, moving slow and steady, with the kind of patience that suggested whoever was riding did not find this weather particularly remarkable. Rose pressed her face to the cracked window and saw a shape resolving out of the darkness. A man on horseback. An enormous man, actually, wide across the shoulders in a way that seemed almost architectural, wearing a long buffalo hide coat that made him look like something that had grown naturally out of the mountain itself. He carried a lantern in one hand and the reins in the other, and he was following the road with the ease of someone who had memorized every rock and turn of it years ago. Rose shoved open the stagecoach door with both hands and half fell out into the snow. "Hello," she shouted, and the wind tried to swallow her voice whole. "Please, hello, I need help." The rider pulled up his horse and turned toward her. She could not see his face clearly in the lantern light, only the suggestion of it, strong jaw, dark eyes catching the flame hair that brushed the collar of his coat where it escaped from beneath the wide brim of his hat. "You alone out here?" he called back, and his voice was the kind of voice that carried in wind, deep and steady and unhurried, as though the blizzard was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "Yes," she called. "The axle broke and the others left, and I've been here for hours." He dismounted in a single fluid motion that spoke of 10,000 repetitions, a man who lived on horseback the way other men lived in chairs. He was even larger standing on the ground than he had appeared on the horse. Rose guessed him somewhere around 6 feet 3 inches, and the buffalo coat only added to the impression of sheer physical mass. He had a rifle slung across his back, and a knife on his belt and hands that looked like they could split firewood without the axe. He walked to her quickly and held the lantern up near her face, studying her with a directness that was not rude but was absolutely without self-consciousness. "How long have you been out here without heat?" he said, "Since around 3 o'clock this afternoon," she said. "It's past 9 now, I think." Something shifted in his expression. 6 hours. "You must be half frozen." He looked at the stagecoach, then back at her. "Can you ride?" "I can try." "The name's Eli Fletcher," he said. "I've got a cabin about 2 miles up the ridge. It's not much, but it's warm and it's solid." "Rose Barrett," she said. "And 2 miles up a ridge sounds like paradise right now." One corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "Let's get you up on the horse then, Miss Barrett." He helped her mount with a straightforward practicality, his hands at her waist briefly, just long enough to lift her into the saddle as if she weighed nothing at all, which she very much did not. Then he took the reins and began walking, leading the horse rather than riding double, and she understood after a moment that he was doing it because he did not want to crowd her, because a woman alone in a blizzard with a stranger did not need to feel trapped against a large man she'd never met before. That consideration, that quiet and deliberate thoughtfulness, struck her somewhere behind her breastbone and stayed there. The journey up the ridge took 40 minutes instead of 20 because of the snow depth, and by the end of it, Eli Fletcher's boots were soaked through, and he hadn't made a single complaint. He talked as they went, partly she suspected to keep her alert, asking her where she was from and where she was headed, and what had brought her to Wyoming in October of all months. She answered him truthfully, and he listened without interrupting, which was rarer in her experience than the blizzard itself. His cabin appeared suddenly out of the tree line, and it was small, but it was real, chinked logs and a stone chimney and a covered porch where cut wood was stacked to the roofline. Smoke was coming from the chimney, thin and gray-blue against the black sky, and the sight of it made Rose feel something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding tight. Eli got her inside first, then saw to his horse, then came back stamping snow from his boots on the porch before he pushed through the door. The cabin's interior was a single room with a stone fireplace at one end, a narrow bunk against one wall, a work table with a lantern, shelves of supplies, pelts stacked in one corner, and the general organized disorder of a man who lived alone and had made his peace with it. A fire was burning low, and Eli crossed to it immediately and added wood with the efficiency of a man who did this a dozen times a day. Rose stood just inside the door, dripping snowmelt onto the plank floor and trying to get her fingers to bend. "Sit close to the fire," Eli said. "Not too close, too fast will hurt you." She sat in the single wooden chair positioned near the hearth and held her hands out toward the growing flames. He disappeared briefly behind her, and she heard the sound of him moving about, the soft knock of something wooden, the rustling of fabric. He came back around and without a word draped a blanket over her shoulders. It was a heavy thing, woven wool, dark green, smelling of wood smoke and the outdoors and him. "That's the last one I've got," he said plainly, already turning away to heat water in a dented tin pot he'd swung over the fire. "Don't argue about it." She had not intended to argue. But she looked at the blanket and then looked at him, taking in the breadth of him now in the firelight. He had removed the buffalo coat and hung it by the door, and without it he was still enormous, the kind of frame that suggested muscles built by actual labor over years rather than anything decorative. His hair was dark brown and just long enough to curl slightly at the ends where it reached his collar, and his jaw was shadowed with several days of beard. His flannel shirt was rolled to the elbows despite the cold, and she could see the definition of his forearms when he adjusted the pot over the fire, which was frankly unreasonable under the circumstances. "I'll repay you," she said. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "This is just what you do for a person out here. Where I come from, people don't always do that." He glanced at her over his shoulder. "Where do you come from?" "St. Louis, originally. I've been in Cheyenne for the last 8 months. My father passed and I was settling his affairs." She paused. "Now I'm going to Denver to look in on my Aunt Clara who isn't well." He turned back to the fire. "I'm sorry about your father." "Thank you." She pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "What brings you to a Wyoming mountain, Mr. Fletcher?" "Nothing brought me," he said. "I came because I wanted to." It was such a simple answer, and he delivered it without any particular pride or defensiveness, just a statement of fact. She thought about it for a while. How long have you been up here? 7 years. Alone. He was quiet for a moment, ladling hot water into a tin cup and bringing it to her. Mostly, he said. She accepted the cup and held it with both hands and felt the heat travel up through her palms and into the rest of her. The water was plain, but it was hot, and it was given with a care that needed no elaboration. Mostly, she repeated. What does that mean? Means I go into town a few times a year. Means my nearest neighbor is a trapper named Walt who stops by maybe once a month to trade supplies and talk at me until I want to drive him off at gunpoint. Another almost smile. I don't, though. He means well. She laughed, and the laugh surprised her, coming out warm and real in the middle of a night that had been nothing but cold and fear. His expression softened when she did, some guardedness easing just enough to show the person beneath it. They talked through the rest of that night. She had not expected that. She had expected silence, perhaps, or the minimal exchange of a practical man performing a practical kindness, and then removing himself to the far end of whatever space was available. Instead, Eli Fletcher talked to her. Slowly at first, answering her questions with economy, but gradually with more volume, more detail, more of the quiet humor that lived behind those dark eyes. He had come from Virginia originally, the son of a tobacco farmer, and he had served in the last year of the war at 17, and come back to find the world he'd left rearranged beyond recognition. He'd moved west by degrees, working cattle drives, working mines, living with a trapper for a season and learning the mountain, until eventually he'd stopped moving because the Wind River Range had simply felt like the right place to stop. You don't miss people? She asked. He considered this with more seriousness than she'd expected. Sometimes, he said, but people are complicated. The mountain's complicated too, but it's honest about it. She thought that was the most interesting thing anyone had said to her in 8 months. He gave her the bunk, and she tried to refuse it, but he shook his head once with a finality that was not unkind but was absolutely not negotiable. He settled himself in the wooden chair by the fire with his rifle propped against the wall beside him, and his long legs stretched toward the hearth and his arms folded across his chest. And from the bunk, she watched him for a while until the warmth and the exhaustion finally pulled her under. She slept without dreaming for the first time since her father's death. The morning came in through the single cabin window like a cold, clean blade of light, and Rose woke to the smell of coffee and something frying, and the sound of Eli moving about with a quiet efficiency that suggested he had been up for some time. She sat up in the bunk and found her traveling coat hung near the fire, dry now, and her boots standing upright beside it. Eli was at the small stove he'd lit in addition to the fireplace, tending a cast-iron pan with the same focused care he seemed to apply to everything. "Morning," he said without turning around, as though he had eyes in the back of his head. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was rough with sleep, and she felt a warmth in her chest that was not entirely attributable to the fire. "How long have you been awake?" "Since before light." He brought her coffee in the same tin cup from the night before, and this time the cup held actual coffee, dark and strong, and she thought she had never in her life been so grateful for a beverage. "The snow's stopped," he said. "Road should be passable by afternoon. I'll take you down to the main track when you're ready and point you toward the nearest stop. Kellerman's trading post is about 6 miles east. They'll have a fresh coach line through within a day or two." She nodded, holding the cup. There was a pinch in her chest at the practicality of it, which she recognized as disproportionate and did not entirely understand. He put a plate in front of her with salt pork and what appeared to be cornbread, and she ate every bit of it without embarrassment while the fire popped and the sunlight grew stronger through the window. "You didn't sleep," she said. "I slept fine," he said. "In that chair, with me in the only bunk. I've slept in worse places." He took his own coffee and leaned against the work table, watching the fire with the ease of a man who was comfortable with silence and with himself. "You needed the sleep more than I did. You were pale as birchwood when I found you last night." She set her cup down. "Eli," she said, and the name came out naturally without the formality of the mister, and she saw him notice it, a subtle shift in his posture. "You gave me your last blanket. The fire was enough for me. That's not the point." He looked at her then, directly, the way he'd looked at her by lantern light outside the coach, that unguarded directness that seemed to be simply how he looked at things. "What's the point then?" "The point is that you didn't know me at all. You found a stranger half frozen on the road in a blizzard, and you brought her into your home and gave her your last blanket and your bed and your food, and you sat up all night in a chair so she could be comfortable." He was quiet. "Most people don't do that," she said. "Most people should," he said, and said it without any indication that he expected to be praised for his own decency, as though it was a simple observation about a deficit in the world rather than a statement about himself. It made her want to press her forehead to his collarbone and stay there, which was not a thought she was accustomed to having about men she had known for less than 12 hours. They spent the rest of the morning in a comfortable limbo, the storm keeping the road uncertain and the world outside quiet and white. She helped him where she could, stacking wood he brought from the porch, washing the breakfast things in the small basin of water he'd melted from snow. He showed her the pelts he'd taken that season, explaining the differences between beaver and mink and marten with the patience of a teacher, and she found herself genuinely absorbed in it, asking questions that made him look at her with something that might have been appreciation. He showed her the view from the ridge behind the cabin when the sky cleared around mid-morning, and she stood at the edge of the trees and looked out at the Wind River Range, spreading itself before her in every direction, and understood why he had stopped here. It was the kind of view that made the whole restless, complicated world feel very small and very far away. She stood beside him in the snow, and their arms were nearly touching, and neither of them moved to increase the distance. "Denver," she said quietly. "It'll still be there in a couple of days." She looked at him. He was looking out at the mountains with that steady, patient expression that seemed to be his natural resting state, as though he was entirely at peace with whatever happened next. "I could stay one more day," she said, "if the road's still poor." He turned his head and looked at her, and there was something careful and genuine in his expression, a man who did not want to say the wrong thing and was taking his time not to. "The road might well be poor," he said, "another day." It was not exactly an invitation, but it was not exactly not one either. She stayed. The second day was different from the first in the way that all second days are, the strangeness wearing down into something more comfortable, the silences becoming less careful and more easy. Eli took her out to check his trap line in the morning, moving through the snow with a long, unhurried stride she had to work to match, and she learned more about tracking and the natural economy of the mountain in 3 hours than she had in her previous 22 years of life. He was not a man who talked constantly, but when he talked about the land or the animals or the way weather moved through the range, there was an aliveness in him that she found herself watching with open attention. He noticed her watching once or twice and did not look away. In the afternoon, she sat at his work table and wrote in the small journal she kept in her traveling bag, and he sat across from her cleaning his rifle with a careful, methodical attention, and the domesticity of it was so unexpectedly pleasant that she found herself smiling at the page for no particular reason. "What are you writing?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "I'm trying to write down what the mountains look like before I forget." He looked up from the rifle. "Why would you forget?" "Because Denver is a city, and cities have a way of replacing everything you've seen with what they want you to see instead." He was quiet for a moment. "That's true," he said finally. "That's very true." She looked at him across the table. The firelight was doing things to the angles of his face that she was trying very hard not to think too carefully about. "Do you ever think about coming down from the mountain?" she asked. "I go down when I need to." "That's not what I asked." He set the rifle down and looked at her steadily. "I think about it sometimes," he said. "Less than I used to. The people I'd have gone back for are mostly gone or moved on." "What about new people?" The silence stretched between them like a thing with weight and dimension. New people are possible, he said quietly. She looked down at her journal. Her heart was doing something embarrassingly theatrical inside her chest, and she was glad the firelight was warm enough to excuse the color in her cheeks. That evening he cooked dried venison in a stew that was plain and perfect, and they ate together at the work table with the fire going strong and the wind picking up again outside, and she told him about her life in St. Louis, the parties her mother had insisted on attending, the suitors her father had politely but persistently suggested, none of whom had interested her in the slightest. Why not? Eli asked. Because they all wanted a certain kind of woman, she said. Very contained, very appropriate. The kind of woman who agrees with everything and decorates a room and doesn't have opinions about anything important. He was watching her with that direct, unhurried attention. You don't strike me as that kind of woman. No, she said, I strike most people as difficult. You strike me as yourself, he said simply. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind pushed through the pines with a sound like the ocean. Eli Fletcher, she said softly. Rose Barrett, he said, and the way he said her name, both of them together, first and last, with that deep, careful voice, was different from the way anyone else had ever said it. It was a name in his mouth, not a label. A thing of some significance. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he went very still, the way a large and powerful thing goes still when it does not want to disturb something small and precious. His hand was rough and warm and enormous beneath hers, and after a moment he turned it over and his fingers closed around hers with a gentleness that was, she thought, the most honestly expressive thing she had ever encountered. Neither of them said anything for a while. When she finally looked up at him, he was looking at her with an expression so open and unguarded that she felt it physically, like pressure in her chest. I should warn you, he said quietly, that I'm not a complicated man. I don't say things I don't mean. I know that, she said. I'm saying it because I don't want you to think that he stopped. I'm not the kind of man who makes a thing out of something that isn't anything. Are you suggesting this is something? She asked. I'm asking if it is. She squeezed his hand. It is, she said. He exhaled slowly, and she felt the tension that had been living in him release by degrees. He rubbed his thumb across her knuckles once, gently, the way you'd stroke something you were afraid of breaking. On the morning of the third day, the road was clear enough to travel, and there was no reasonable argument against it. Rose packed her traveling bag with the same quiet deliberateness she'd observed in him, folding things neatly, checking the latch on her journal. She put on her dried traveling coat and laced her boots at the door, and Eli saddled his horse in the bright morning cold without being asked. They did not speak much on the ride down the ridge. She rode behind him this time, not in front, and her arms were around his waist because the path was steep in places, and she needed to hold on, and neither of them felt compelled to offer a more complicated explanation for it than that. Kellerman's trading post came into view around noon, a low, broad building at the crossroads with smoke from 2 chimneys and horses tied at the rail and the sound of voices carrying in the cold air. Eli pulled up at the edge of the road and helped her down, and they stood together in the space between the horse and the post door, and the feeling of impending separation was so present between them that it was almost a sound. You'll go to Denver, he said. Yes. And your aunt? Yes. He looked at a point somewhere to the left of her face and then corrected it and looked at her. I don't have a way to write to you, he said. I mean, there's no address for a mountain. No, she agreed. There isn't. He reached up and pushed a strand of her dark hair back from her face, a brief and deliberate gesture, and she closed her eyes for just a moment at the touch of his fingers. Come back through Wyoming, he said. In the spring, maybe. The road through the pass is better in May. She opened her eyes. He was looking at her with that same careful hope she'd seen the night before, the kind that was more honest for how quietly it held itself. I will come back through Wyoming, she said. In May. I'll be on that mountain, he said. I know where to find you. She went up on her toes and kissed him once firmly on the jaw, which was as close to his mouth as her nerve would take her at a public crossroads in 1878. And she felt his hand find her waist for just a moment before she stepped back. He stood at the road's edge and watched her until she disappeared through the trading post door, and she turned back once to look at him, and he lifted his hand just slightly, and she lifted hers. Denver was everything she had expected and nothing she wanted. Her Aunt Clara's house was comfortable and warm and smelled of lavender water and old wood, and Clara herself was frail but sharp-minded, a woman of 60 who had buried 2 husbands and had opinions about everything, and was genuinely glad to see Rose. The illness that had worried the family turned out to be a persistent chest cold that had been exaggerated in the retelling, and within 3 weeks of Rose's arrival, Clara was well enough to host a small supper party and tell embarrassing stories about Rose's childhood at the table. It should have been pleasant. It was pleasant. But Rose moved through the Denver days with the feeling of something caught in her chest, a persistent ache that she recognized with growing clarity as being shaped exactly like Eli Fletcher. She thought about him when she woke in the mornings. She thought about his hands and the unhurried way he moved, and the quality of his listening, and the way the firelight had looked on his face across the work table. She thought about the blanket he'd put around her without ceremony or expectation. She thought about the word something and the way he'd said it. She wrote him a letter she could not send because there was no address for a mountain. She wrote it anyway in her journal in the careful handwriting her mother had made her practice every day for years, and she told him about the Denver streets and the crowded restaurants, and the way the mountains looked from the city, distant and permanent and blue. She told him she was counting the weeks until May. March was cold and tedious. April grew warmer, and the city around her bloomed and lightened, and Rose felt herself lightening with it, the weight of the past year beginning to lift as though the world was finally done requiring her grief. She helped Clara plant kitchen herbs in the back garden and learned to make proper biscuits from Clara's cook, and she wrote 3 genuine letters to her friend in St. Louis and spent an afternoon in a dressmaker's shop that made her feel, for the first time in months, like a woman who had a future rather than just a past. She booked a seat on the northbound stagecoach for the 5th of May. On the 4th of May, she sat in Clara's parlor in the evening and felt a nervousness in her stomach that was entirely different from every other kind she'd known. This nervousness was sharp and bright and had a forward-pointing quality to it, as though her whole self was already moving toward something even while she sat still in a padded chair with her hands in her lap. "You're going to see someone," Clara said from across the parlor, not looking up from her needlework. Rose startled. "What?" "You've had the look of a woman going to see someone since about February," Clara said, still not looking up. "I've been married twice. I know what it looks like." Rose was quiet for a moment. "His name is Eli Fletcher," she said. "He's a mountain man in the Wind River Range." Clara looked up now. "A mountain man?" "Yes. Rose, darling, your mother will." "My mother is in St. Louis," Rose said calmly, "and I am 22 years old." Clara studied her for a moment and then went back to her needlework with the expression of a woman who had decided to be wise. "Well," she said, "I suppose there's something to be said for a man who knows how to take care of himself in hard conditions." "There is a great deal to be said for it," Rose said. The stage north from Denver reached the crossroads at Kellerman's trading post on the afternoon of the 7th of May, and Rose climbed out with her traveling bag and stood in the spring sunshine and breathed in the mountain air, which was cold and clean and smelled of pine and snowmelt, and the particular freshness of a world recently thawed. She was not certain he would come. She had no way to have told him exactly when she'd arrive. He had said May, and she had said May, and they had made that agreement on faith, which was, she was aware, not a particularly solid material. She went inside the trading post and spoke to the man behind the counter, a large, red-faced Swede named Kellerman who knew Eli Fletcher well enough to say, without being asked, "He was in here 3 days ago asking if any coach had come through from the south." Rose felt the nervousness in her stomach become something else entirely. "He comes in once a month," Kellerman said, studying her with cheerful curiosity. "Mostly for supplies, but he's been in twice this week." I don't suppose you could send word to him, she said. Kellerman smiled broadly. Don't need to, he said, looking past her toward the window. She turned. Eli Fletcher was tying his horse at the rail outside. He had seen the stagecoach. He must have been watching the road. He came through the trading post door with that long, unhurried stride of his, and he stopped when he saw her, and the expression on his face was so unguarded and so genuinely glad that it undid something in her completely. You came, he said. I said I would, she said. He crossed the room and he did not overthink it. He took her face in both hands and looked at her for just a moment, long enough to be sure she was real. And then he kissed her properly, right there in Kellerman's trading post with Kellerman watching and making no effort to pretend otherwise. And she kissed him back with 6 months of Denver winters and written letters and sleepless nights, and every thought she'd had about him since October built into it. And it was the least complicated thing she had done in a very long time. Kellerman applauded once, a single clap, and she heard him laugh. Eli pulled back and looked at her with the quiet intensity that was simply how he looked at the world. His hands were still framing her face and his thumbs were tracing her cheekbones, and she thought she could stand here in this spot for a very long time without objecting to any part of it. I've been thinking about you since October, he said. I've been writing letters to you I couldn't send, she said. In my journal. Something in his expression moved. Will you show me? Someday, she said. Maybe. He smiled then, a real one, full and warm, and it transformed his face in a way she suspected not many people were privileged to see, and she felt the specific satisfaction of being in the group of people who had. They rode up to the cabin in the afternoon light with the spring mountains showing every shade of green she'd ever imagined, and some she hadn't, and the Wind River Range spread itself around them with the same vast, permanent beauty she remembered from October. The snow was gone from the lower elevations, and the meadow near the cabin was showing the first wildflowers, small and yellow, persistent in the way that wildflowers in the mountains always were. The cabin looked different in May than it had in October, larger somehow, the proportions the same but the light better, the windows doing more work, the covered porch showing itself as a genuinely pleasant place to sit. Someone, which was to say Eli, had put a new shutter on the window that had cracked in the October storm. You fixed the window, she said. He looked at it. Didn't make sense to leave it. She understood that he had made the cabin the best it was, that there was care in the new shutter and the swept porch and the fresh split firewood stacked in its familiar place, and that the care was in some part for her, even though he would never say so in those exact words, because he was not a man who said things for decoration. She stayed. She had told herself she would stay a week. She stayed 3, and in those 3 weeks she lived a life so different from anything she had ever known that it felt like breathing with a different set of lungs. She learned to read the weather from the way the clouds stacked above the peaks. She learned which plants near the cabin were edible. She learned to start a fire from nearly nothing, a lesson that Eli taught with unhurried patience, crouching beside her in the dirt outside the cabin door while she struck the flint for the 12th time and got it on the 13th. There, he said when the tinder caught. Finally, she said. You did it on your 13th try, he said. I didn't get it until my 22nd. She looked at him. You're making that up. I am not, he said, and his expression was so completely serious that she believed him, and the belief made her laugh, and the laugh made him smile, and they were crouching in the dirt outside a mountain cabin, and it was one of the happiest moments of her life. He took her fishing in the creek that ran half a mile below the cabin, and she caught more trout than he did on a certain afternoon that he would later claim was an anomaly caused by the particular light that day. And she kept the memory of his expression when she pulled in her 3rd fish like a trophy she intended to display indefinitely. They rode out across the high meadows on clear days, and she came to understand the scale of the landscape in a way that maps and paintings never could have communicated, the actual immensity of the mountains, the depth of the valleys, the sheer ambition of the sky. She understood why he had stayed. She was beginning to understand how someone could. The evenings were the best part. The evenings were fire and coffee and talk, and the particular companionable silence of two people who had gotten past the need to fill every quiet with noise. She read to him from the books she'd brought in her traveling bag, Dickens and George Eliot, and a volume of poems by Walt Whitman that she had carried for 2 years without properly reading, and he listened with his eyes closed, and his head tilted back and something in his face that was completely at rest. She watched him when he didn't know she was watching and thought about the word home and what it was made of. It was on a Thursday evening in late May, the fire going and the last light fading from the window, that he set down the cup he'd been holding and looked at her across the small space of the cabin with an expression she had not seen on him before, careful and serious and somehow more open than usual, as though he had decided to set down a weight he'd been carrying. "I need to say something," he said. She set down her book. "All right. I've been trying to figure out how to say it for about 3 weeks." "That's a long time to think about something." "Yes," he said, "it is." He rubbed the back of his neck, the only self-conscious gesture she had ever seen from him. "I don't have much, Rose. I have this cabin and the land and the horse and what I take from the mountain. It's a life that's real and honest and mine, but it's not what you came from and it's not what you were raised for." She was very still, watching him. "I know that," he said. "I know you've got a world down in those cities, people who know your name and places you belong. And I wouldn't want you to give up things that matter to you." He looked at her directly, his dark eyes steady and warm. "But I would like very much to ask if you would consider this as a life you could want. With me, properly, I mean. As my wife, if you'd have me." Silence in the cabin was the good kind, the kind that comes just before something. "Eli Fletcher," she said quietly. "Rose Barrett," he said with the same weight he'd always given her name. "I have been sleeping in your bunk for 3 weeks," she said. "I've been on that chair 3 weeks," he said. "I know," she said. "And I've been lying there every night thinking that of all the kinds of men in the world you might be the only kind worth marrying." He was very still. "Ask me again," she said. "Will you marry me?" He said, and his voice was steady, but she could see the held breath of it in his whole body. "Yes," she said. He was across the cabin in 2 steps, and then she was standing and his arms were around her, and she was pressed against the broad warmth of him, and she could feel the slow release of every tension in his frame, like a rope finally let slack. His chin rested on top of her head, and she could feel his heartbeat against her cheek, and it was steady and strong and very much alive. "I need to write to Clara," she said, muffled against his shirt. "Your aunt in Denver. She'll want to know. And she'll want to meet you. All right. She'll probably interrogate you about your prospects. I have 400 good pelts and 800 acres of mountain," he said. "What are my prospects?" She laughed against his chest. "Excellent," she said. "By any honest measure, excellent." The summer that followed was one for Rose Barrett to hold against every subsequent hard thing the world might offer, a reservoir of good that she could draw from in lean times. She and Eli were married on a Saturday in June at the small church in the town of Riverton, which was the nearest town of any size to the mountain, a 2-day ride down through the range. The minister was a compact man named Reverend Dawes, who had married 100 couples on the frontier and conducted the ceremony with warmth and brevity, which suited both of them perfectly. Walt, Eli's trapper neighbor, served as witness. He was a broad, bearded man in his 50s, who wept openly during the vows and blew his nose on his sleeve and told Rose afterward that Eli was a good man who had been alone too long, as though she had not arrived at this conclusion independently. Kellerman from the trading post came with his wife, Ingrid, a capable and cheerful Swedish woman who brought a gift of a new wool blanket, a thick, beautiful red-and-white woven one, which she handed to Rose with a particular smile that suggested Eli had told her at some point about the October night and the last blanket. "I hear you needed one of these," Ingrid said. "I did," Rose said. "He gave me his. I haven't stopped thinking about him since." "Good man," Ingrid said simply. "Yes," Rose agreed. "The best one." Eli's face during the ceremony was something she would keep in her memory with care, not the expression of a man performing a public obligation, but the expression of a man who could not quite believe his own good fortune and was determined to be worthy of it. He held her hands throughout the vows with the same careful gentleness she'd come to know, as though she was something precious. And when Reverend Dawes said the final words and Eli kissed her in front of the small assembly in the little Riverton church, Walt blew his nose again, and Kellerman applauded with the same single clap he'd produced in the trading post. They rode back up to the mountain the next morning as Mr. and Mrs. Fletcher, and the mountains received them with absolute indifference, which was entirely appropriate and which made Rose love them for it. There was practical reality to the life, and she did not shy from it. Eli had been honest with her about what the mountain asked of its inhabitants, and she found that the asking suited her. She was stronger than she'd known. The life had a physical honesty to it that she found deeply satisfying, the cause and effect of her own effort visible in the cut wood and the preserved vegetables and the fire that burned because she'd built it. She wrote long letters to Clara and shorter ones to her mother in St. Louis, who replied with a careful letter full of concern and a second letter, arriving a month later, full of a more genuine curiosity that suggested she was coming around. Her mother visited the following summer and spent 3 days on the mountain and went home having made a compact with the landscape, a cautious peace between the life she'd wanted for her daughter and the life her daughter had clearly chosen with her whole self. She loved Eli within those 3 days, quietly and without ever announcing it, in the way that a practical woman loves a man who is good to her child, and Rose saw it and was glad. The cabin grew that first winter. Eli built out the back room with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything, planning it through the fall and beginning the framing when the first hard freeze made trapping less productive. Rose helped where she could and watched where she couldn't and brought him coffee in the cold mornings while he worked. The new room gave them a proper bedroom, separate from the main space, with a real bed frame Eli built from pine and a mattress Rose ordered from Denver in a transaction that required a letter, a 3-month wait, and a delivery that Kellerman facilitated with cheerful goodwill. "I'm not sleeping in that chair another winter," Eli told Walt, who had helped with the framing. "Very reasonable of you," Walt said seriously. "I meant for Rose," Eli said with a straight face. Walt looked at Rose. Rose looked at Walt. Both of them looked at Eli. "That's not what you meant," Rose said. "No," Eli admitted, and the smile broke through. In the second year of their marriage, Rose realized she was expecting, and she sat with the knowledge for a full day before she told Eli, turning it over in her mind the way you turn something new and bright to see how the light moves across it. She told him in the evening by the fire, as she told him most things, and the expression that crossed his face was one she had never seen before and would never quite be able to describe. A depth of gladness that seemed to come from a place below what was normally visible, as though a room had opened in him that had been locked for a long time. He pulled her against him and held her for a long, quiet time without speaking. "All right," she said eventually. "Better than all right," he said, and his voice was rougher than usual. She felt him press his lips to her hair, and she closed her eyes and thought that this was the definition of enough, right here, this moment, this man, this mountain. They rode down to Riverton before the winter roads closed to see the doctor, a sensible man named Braddock who had delivered 300 babies on the frontier, and approached the whole business with a cheerful matter-of-factness that Rose found reassuring. He declared her healthy and the baby well-positioned and told Eli to stop looking like a man waiting for a verdict and start looking like a man who was going to be a father. "She'll be fine," Braddock said. "She's as strong as anyone I've seen come through here." Eli looked at Rose. "I know that," he said. "Then stop hovering," Rose told him. He did not stop hovering, but he became less obvious about it, which she accepted as a fair compromise. The winter of the second year was long and hard, the kind of Wyoming winter that seemed to settle in and make itself permanently at home. But the cabin was well provisioned, and warm, and Eli had built the new room with extra chinking, and a second stove so the bedroom kept its heat independently of the main room. They spent the long, snowbound evenings reading and talking and playing cards with Walt when he came through, and Rose felt the baby moving under her hands and thought that if she could have drawn a picture of everything she had ever wanted and compared it to what she actually had, the comparison would have surprised her considerably. She had not known she wanted this. She had not known to want something she had never seen clearly enough to name, but here it was, named by the living of it. The baby came in early March at the beginning of the thaw, which felt appropriate. Eli rode down for the midwife, a Shoshone woman named Mary Blue Water who lived with her family at the base of the range, and who had delivered more babies in more difficult circumstances than most doctors ever encountered. She arrived with her kit and her calm authority, and she and Rose regarded each other for a short time, and came to an immediate mutual respect. Eli was banished to the porch, where he split more firewood than the cabin could hold in 2 winters. Walt reported later, not having been there himself, but having heard the story from Kellerman, who had heard it from Mary Blue Water's nephew. The baby was a boy. Rose named him James, after her father, and Eli said it was a good name with the simple decisiveness of a man who meant it. James Fletcher arrived in the world with a full set of opinions that he expressed continuously and at volume, and he had Eli's dark eyes and Rose's stubborn set to his mouth, and from the first moment Eli held him, which was approximately 45 seconds after his arrival in the world, the two of them were bound in the specific wordless way of fathers and firstborn sons. "He's so small," Eli said, in a tone that Rose recognized as sheer astonishment. "He will not always be small," Rose said, exhausted and deeply happy. "He will be enormous. Look at who his father is." Eli looked at her over the baby's head, his expression so raw and so full that she felt her eyes fill. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. "I love you too." James grew with the seasons, a sturdy, curious child who showed from his earliest walking days a preference for the outdoors and a fearlessness regarding the natural world that delighted his father and occasionally alarmed his mother. By the time he was 2, he could identify animal tracks in the mud, and by 3, he had a firm opinion about horses, which was that he wanted to ride them. And Eli put him up on the saddle in front of him by the child's 3rd birthday, and James's expression of absolute triumph was so purely Eli that Rose stood in the cabin doorway and laughed until she had to hold on to the door frame. Life on the mountain organized itself around the seasons with a clarity that Rose had come to love. Spring was fishing and planting, and the return of the wildflowers to the meadow. Summer was long days and hard work and evenings that seemed to last forever, the light holding in the western sky until nearly 10 o'clock. Autumn was the trapping season and the work of preserving, putting up vegetables and salting meat, and checking the cord of firewood. Winter was the long, interior season, the one that belonged to books and fire and each other, and James's loud opinions about everything. They made the journey to Riverton twice a year, and to Denver once, which satisfied Rose's need for the world beyond the mountain without making her long for it the rest of the time. Clara's health had stabilized, and she was, in her 70s, one of the most formidable women Rose had ever known, and she and Eli had established a relationship of genuine mutual fondness, Clara asking him pointed questions about the state of the world and Eli answering them with the same honest directness he brought to everything, and Clara declaring him the most sensible man she had ever met, which was high praise from Clara. The years moved in the honest, unmarked way that good years do. In the 4th year of their marriage, Rose's 2nd pregnancy proceeded smoothly through the summer, and in the October of that year, 4 years to the month from the night of the blizzard and the broken axle and the lantern moving toward her through the dark, their daughter was born. Rose named her Eleanor, and she had Rose's dark hair and Eli's calm, watchful eyes, and she appeared to have arrived in the world with a serenity that her brother entirely lacked, studying everything around her with a patient attention that made Eli say, when she was 3 weeks old, "She's going to be the quiet one. She's going to be the one who figures everything out before anyone else knows there's a problem," Rose said. "That too," Eli said. The cabin expanded again when Alina was a year old, Eli adding a proper loft reached by a wooden ladder for James, who had been petitioning for a space of his own since approximately the moment Alina arrived and established her presence in the main bedroom. James was delighted with the loft in the absolute, uncomplicated way of 5-year-old boys, and spent a significant portion of the following week inventing reasons to climb the ladder. Walt came through on a November afternoon when the first serious snow of the year was just beginning to fall and found James at the top of the loft ladder and Eli standing below with his arms out. "What are you doing?" Walt said. "Catching practice," Eli said. "He's teaching me to jump," James said from the loft with enormous pride. Rose appeared from the back room. "He is doing no such thing," she said. Both Eli and James achieved identical expressions of transparent innocence. Walt turned around and went back to the porch to wait for the argument to resolve itself, and from outside he could hear Rose's voice and Eli's low response, and then, inexplicably, laughter, and he shook his head and smiled at the mountains and thought that some things were better than he'd ever expected them to be. By the time James was 6 and Alina was 2, the cabin had become something the original structure would not have recognized. Rooms added with care and purpose, a proper kitchen shelf, a covered porch that wrapped one full side of the building, a small barn for the horses and the 2 cows that had arrived in their 4th year and whose milk had transformed their daily life considerably. Rose kept a kitchen garden on the south side of the cabin where the slope provided some shelter, and in summer she grew enough to supplement significantly what they took from the mountain and what they bought at Kellerman's. She had a table in the corner of the main room, near the window, where she wrote letters to Clara, letters to her mother, entries in the journal she had kept since St. Louis, and something else too more recently. A record of the life, detailed and specific, written with the same attention to the natural world that Eli had first shown her, the way the light changed through the seasons, the behavior of the animals they saw, the particular silence of the mountain in January when the cold was at its deepest and most complete. She did not know yet what she would do with the writing. She knew only that it mattered, that it was hers, that it lived alongside the cabin and the children and the marriage as its own necessary thing. Eli knew about it. He read what she showed him with the same focused attention he gave everything, and told her what he thought in the honest, measured way he had, and what he thought was that she was good at it and that someone other than herself should read it eventually. "Send it to someone," he said one evening, handing the pages back to her. "To whom?" "A paper, a magazine. There are women writing about the West." He looked at her. "You know the West. You know it the way most people who write about it don't." She looked down at the pages. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's what you said about marrying me," he said, "and then you did it, so I'm encouraged." She sent a portion of it to a Denver publication in the spring, a modest magazine that published frontier accounts and natural history. The response came in 6 weeks and said yes. The piece appeared in print the following autumn, and Rose sat at her table near the window and held the printed page, and felt a particular and specific gladness that had nothing to do with anyone else's opinion of her, and everything to do with the satisfaction of having done a thing she believed in. Eli read his copy of the magazine by firelight and did not say anything for a long time, and then he said, "You're the best person I know at putting the mountain into words." She looked at him. His expression was the one she'd learned to read as his version of overwhelming emotion, which was to say it looked largely the same as his normal expression, but with a slight additional openness around the eyes and a deliberateness to his breathing. "Eli Fletcher," she said softly. "Rose Fletcher," he said, and smiled. James turned 7 in March of that year and received, as his birthday gift, the promise of a pony that Eli had been quietly arranging through Kellerman for 3 months. The pony arrived on a Thursday afternoon, a compact gray animal with a calm disposition that immediately proceeded to eat part of the fence Eli had just rebuilt, establishing its character definitively. James named it General, which Eli said was too grand a name for a fence-eating pony, and which James therefore never changed. Alina at 3 was a serious child who watched everything with those steady dark eyes and had a habit of appearing silently at adult conversations and listening without comment until she had something to add, which was usually something that reframed the entire discussion. Rose recognized the quality because she'd seen it every day for 6 years in the man Alina had gotten it from. One morning in late June, Rose found Eli standing on the south side of the meadow near the first wildflowers, just standing and looking out at the range with his arms crossed and his hat in his hand and the morning sun on him, and she came to stand beside him and looked at the same mountains they had been looking at together for 6 years. "Do you remember the October you found me?" she said. He looked at her. "Every detail," he said. "What were you thinking when you saw me fall out of that stagecoach?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking I'd found the most determined woman I'd ever seen," he said. Standing in a blizzard without a coat proper for it, half frozen, and she still called out. She didn't just wait to be found, she called out. She considered this. She had not thought of it that way before. "I was terrified," she said. "I know," he said, "but you called out anyway. That's not a small thing." She leaned against his arm. He put the arm around her and she tucked under it in the way that had become simply where she fit in the world, the specific warmth of him and the smell of wood smoke and the outdoors that was simply what Eli Fletcher smelled like. "You gave me your last blanket," she said. "It was getting thin anyway," he said. She looked up at him. He was looking at the mountains, but the corner of his mouth was moving. "You never do let a gesture stand on its own, do you?" she said. He looked down at her. "I gave it to you because you needed it and because I had it to give," he said. "That's the whole of it." "I know," she said, "and I never forgot your name, not for a single day." He looked at her for a long moment and she could see all of it in his face. The 7 years alone on the mountain and the October night and the morning he'd put her on his horse, and the 6 months of May he'd been waiting for, and the June wedding in Riverton and the children and the years and the whole accumulated weight of what they had made together. And he wore it all with the same quiet steadiness he brought to everything, unashamed and open and entirely himself. "Good," he said, "because I never stopped being glad you knew it." He kissed her then, in the morning sun in the meadow with the Wind River range spread out around them and the wildflowers at their feet, and she kissed him back with everything she had, which was considerable. James's voice carried from somewhere near the barn, demanding assistance with General, who had apparently gotten himself into the supply shed and was investigating the oat barrel with professional interest. Eli pulled back from the kiss with an expression caught between amusement and resignation. "I'll go," he said. "I know," she said. "I love you." "I love you," he said, and he said it with the same directness he'd always had, uncomplicated and certain and real. He went toward the barn at that long, unhurried stride of his, and she watched him go and then turned back to the mountains. And the morning was brilliant around her, cold and clean and exactly right. The winter that followed was the kind that tested everything, a long, deep freeze that kept them cabin-bound for stretches of a week or more, and depleted their wood supply faster than expected and required a level of creative provision that challenged and sharpened them both. But they came through it with their stores intact and their spirits sound and their children healthy. And when the spring thaw arrived in April and the meadow came back, and the first wildflowers pushed through the mud with their ordinary, extraordinary tenacity, Rose stood in the cabin doorway and breathed in the new season and felt something settle in her that was simply the deep, unargued satisfaction of a life well chosen. Eli came to stand behind her in the doorway, his hands on her shoulders, looking out at the same morning. "Better," he said. "Better," she said. "Every year better." He pressed a kiss to the side of her head. Alina appeared at their feet with a proprietary air and inserted herself between them and the doorway as though she had just realized she was missing something interesting. "What are we doing?" Eleanor said. Looking at the spring, Rose said. Eleanor looked. She considered the meadow with her father's patient attention. It looks like last spring, she said. Every spring looks like the last one, Eli said, and every spring is new. Eleanor processed this. All right, she said, and went back inside, satisfied. Rose turned her head and looked at Eli. He was looking at the mountains with a contentment on his face so deep and so earned that it made her chest ache with love for him. They had the life they had built, and they had built it well, and it was real, and it was theirs, all of it. The cabin with its added rooms and its swept porch and its kitchen garden. The mountain standing enormous and patient in every direction. James and his pony and his loft and his growing opinions about everything. Eleanor and her watchful eyes and her early wisdom. The journals that had become something more. The long winter evenings and the spring mornings and the years moving in their honest, unmarked way with all the everyday wonders built inside them. Eli Fletcher had found a stranded woman on the side of a mountain road in a blizzard in October of 1878, and had given her his last blanket without ceremony or expectation, and she had never forgotten his name, had carried it through 6 months of Denver winter like a compass that always pointed north, had come back to him in the May of the following year and stayed, and made a life with him that neither of them had entirely known to imagine, but both of them had recognized, without hesitation, as exactly what they wanted. The name Eli Fletcher lived in her like the first deep breath after a long cold, like the memory of warmth on a day too dark to remember it clearly, like the particular quality of firelight on a man's face across a work table on the second night you have ever known him. When you understand for the first time that knowing a person and recognizing them are not always the same thing, and that sometimes you recognize someone before you have had nearly enough time to know them. And the knowing is just the long and glad work of the life that follows. She had recognized him. She had known him. She was knowing him still, and would be knowing him for all the years ahead, in this cabin on this mountain in the Wind River Range where the wildflowers came back every spring without being asked, stubborn and bright and entirely unwilling to concede the cold. That was the whole of it, and it was more than enough, and it was everything.